Where is my wife's bracelet, Denise?
I don't know, Mr. Calloway. I never touched it.
And you only one there.
Then check the cameras.
You'll see 11 missing minutes.
Then someone erased them.
Are you saying one framed you?
6 a.m., and the Calloway mansion is still wrapped in that gray, uncertain light that comes before the sun fully commits to the day. Marcus Calloway stands alone in his marble foyer, still in the same shirt he wore the night before, because he never made it to bed. In his hand is a small velvet box, the kind that once held something no insurance policy could ever truly replace. His late wife's diamond bracelet. The one piece of her he refused to sell, refused to lock away in a vault, refused to treat like an asset instead of a memory. The box is open. The box is empty. His jaw is tight. His knuckles pale around the velvet. And for a man worth more money than most small countries, he has never in his life felt this powerless standing in his own home. Security has already been called, their black SUVs pulling into the circular driveway with a quiet urgency that says this is not a drill. Marcus doesn't move. He can't. His eyes are locked on the staircase above him, where Denise Whitaker has just frozen mid-step, a laundry basket balanced against her hip, her breath catching so sharply it's almost audible in the silence of the house. She is the only member of staff on the property at this hour. Everyone else won't arrive for another 40 minutes. Behind her, the head housekeeper gasps, one hand rising to cover her mouth, because she understands instantly what this looks like, even if she has no idea what actually happened. For a long moment, nobody speaks. Marcus's eyes narrow, not with rage exactly, but with something colder, something that has spent 2 years hardening around every loss he's refused to fully grieve. Denise doesn't look away, though every instinct in her body is screaming at her to run, to explain, to do something other than stand frozen under the weight of his stare. She has never stolen anything in her life. Not as a child scraping by, not as a widow drowning in medical bills, not now. In this house that pays her more than she's ever earned and asks so little of her in return. And yet, in this exact instant, none of that history matters. All that matters is an empty box, a locked room, and 11 minutes of security footage that, according to the guard now whispering into his radio, simply doesn't exist. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next in that house would force one man to question everything he thought he knew about loyalty, and one woman to decide exactly how much dignity she was willing to trade for survival. Somewhere in those missing 11 minutes lies the answer to a mystery that will not just clear a woman's name. It will expose a betrayal that has been quietly unfolding under Marcus Calloway's roof for years. Hidden behind a smile, he trusted more than his own instincts. The cameras didn't fail that morning. Someone made sure of that. And by the time the full truth comes to light, it won't just change how Marcus sees Denise. It will change how he sees everyone he has ever called family. 3 months earlier, none of this had happened yet. And Denise Whitaker's biggest concern wasn't a missing bracelet or a billionaire suspicion. It was making the 6:15 bus before the fare changed, the one that got her to the East Side transfer with just enough time to catch the second bus that carried her the rest of the way into the wealthiest neighborhood she had ever set foot in, let alone worked in. She'd taken 2 buses every morning since her husband died 18 months earlier, back when a warehouse accident took him from her, and left behind a stack of medical bills so tall it seemed to mock her every time she opened the mail. Her son, Tyler, was 15 now, old enough to notice how tired she looked, too young to fully understand why she never let herself rest. The Calloway estate had been the answer to a job posting she almost didn't apply for. Certain a woman like her had no business inside a house like that. But the pay was nearly double what she'd made at her last position, and pride has never once paid a hospital bill. Her first morning inside those gates, she remembers feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life, dwarfed by ceilings that stretched 2 stories high and hallways longer than her entire apartment. What struck her wasn't the wealth, though. It was the silence. A house with everything money could buy, and somehow, nobody in it seemed happy. Denise's first assignment inside the mansion was the East Wing, a section of the house so rarely used that dust had settled undisturbed across furniture nobody had touched in what looked like years. She moved carefully, almost reverently, the way you handle things that clearly still matter to someone even if that someone isn't in the room. In one corner, she found a wedding photograph, framed slightly crooked, glass smudged with the kind of neglect that comes not from carelessness but from avoidance. A beautiful woman smiled out from behind that glass, standing beside a much younger version of the man Denise had only glimpsed once so far, from a distance, walking briskly through the foyer without acknowledging a single member of his own staff. She didn't ask questions that first day. She simply straightened the frame, wiped the glass clean, and moved on, unaware that small gesture would matter more than she could have imagined. Isabel Reyes, the head of household staff, took an immediate liking to Denise, recognizing in her the same quiet steadiness she valued in herself after 11 years working in that house. Over a rushed lunch break in the staff kitchen, Isabel warned her gently about the unspoken rules of the estate. Never touch anything in the private study. Never rearrange anything in what used to be Mrs. Calloway's reading room. And always be careful around Naomi Bishop, the executive assistant who had run the household's finances and Marcus's entire life for the past 15 years with a level of control that bordered on possessive. Isabel didn't elaborate further, but something in the way she lowered her voice when she said Naomi's name told Denise this wasn't simple office gossip. That night, back in her cramped apartment, Denise sat at the kitchen table grating nothing, staring instead at a stack of bills that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours she worked. Tyler sat across from her, headphones half on, half off, pretending to do homework while clearly distracted by something heavier weighing on him. She noticed the fresh scrape on his knuckles before he tried to hide his hand under the table. Another fight at school. Another conversation neither of them had the energy to have that night. She let it go for now, telling herself she'd address it once she wasn't so exhausted her bones ached, not realizing how much that decision would come to weigh on her in the weeks ahead. Across town, in a house far larger than Denise's entire apartment building, Marcus Calloway sat alone at a dining table built to seat 20 people, eating a meal he didn't taste, in a silence he had grown almost comfortable in. It had been 2 years since Vivian died. 2 years since laughter had echoed naturally through those halls, instead of being carefully avoided like something fragile that might shatter if handled wrong. He kept her office exactly as she'd left it. Her reading chair by the window, angled just slightly toward the garden she used to tend herself. Nobody was allowed to move it. Nobody had dared to, until a new housekeeper who didn't yet know the rules wandered into that room 3 days later with an entirely different kind of intention. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, overcast day that made the mansion's tall windows look almost mournful, light filtering in weak and pale across hardwood floors that gleamed from decades of careful maintenance. Denise had been assigned to the study that day, a room she didn't yet know carried the weight of 2 years' worth of grief locked inside it. She dusted methodically, the way she'd been trained, working her way toward the window where a reading chair sat angled oddly toward the garden outside. To her, it looked simply out of place, slightly crooked against the natural symmetry of the room, and so she did what any diligent housekeeper would do. She straightened it, squared it against the wall, restored what looked to her eyes like order. She didn't hear Marcus enter. She only felt the sudden shift in the air, that particular stillness that comes when someone is standing behind you, watching, before they've said a single word. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked through the quiet like something breaking. That chair does not move. Ever. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a sharpness that made Denise's spine straighten instantly, her hand still resting on the back of the chair she now understood, too late, meant something far beyond furniture. She turned to face him, and for the first time, she saw his eyes up close, not cold exactly, but haunted in a way that made her anger soften into something closer to understanding before she'd even said a word. "I'm sorry," she said simply, without groveling, without the frantic over-apologizing most staff might have offered a man capable of ending their employment with a single phone call. "I didn't know. I'll put it back exactly where it was." Something about her steadiness seemed to catch him off guard. Most people either crumbled under his temper or bristled defensively against it. Denise did neither. She simply moved the chair back into its precise, familiar angle, smoothed the cushion with a gentleness that suggested she understood, without needing an explanation, that this chair belonged to someone who was no longer there to sit in it. Marcus watched her in silence, something flickering behind his expression that he didn't have a name for yet, and didn't examine closely enough to notice at the time. He left the room without another word. But that night, for the first time and longer than he could remember, he found himself thinking about someone other than Vivian before he fell asleep. Not in any way he understood yet, not in any way he would have admitted out loud, even to himself. Just a passing thought about a housekeeper who hadn't cowered, hadn't made excuses, and had somehow understood the weight of an object she knew nothing about. Meanwhile, in another wing of the house, Naomi Bishop watched the entire exchange play back on a small monitor in her office, her expression unreadable, her fingers tapping once against the edge of her desk before she minimized the screen and returned to the ledger she'd been quietly altering for the better part of 2 years. The following week brought the first sign that something in the household had shifted, though nobody yet understood exactly what. A pair of cufflinks, gold, engraved with Marcus's initials, a gift from Vivian on their 10th anniversary, went missing from his dressing room. He noticed almost immediately, the way people notice absences in objects tied to memory rather than mere value. He mentioned it in passing to Naomi during their morning briefing, more curious than concerned, assuming perhaps he'd simply misplaced them somewhere in the chaos of his schedule. Naomi's response was measured, careful, delivered with the practiced calm of someone who had spent 15 years anticipating his every question before he asked it. She suggested, gently, that perhaps he should consider who had access to that wing recently, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the new housekeeper had been assigned there just days earlier. Marcus didn't think much of it at the time, filing the comment away without giving it the weight it would later carry. But 2 weeks after that, a signed first edition novel disappeared from the library shelf, a book worth more to Marcus for its inscription than its rarity, a gift from a mentor long since passed. Again, Naomi was the one to raise it, again with that same careful neutrality, again finding a way to mention that Denise had been working in that section of the house recently. She never made direct accusations. She was far too practiced for something so clumsy. She simply planted seeds, one conversation at a time, watching them take root in a grieving man's mind that was already primed to expect loss around every corner. Isabel noticed the pattern before Marcus did. She pulled Denise aside one afternoon in the quiet of the laundry room, voice low, eyes darting toward the hallway before she spoke. She told her, carefully, that Naomi had a history of pushing out staff she didn't personally select, that 3 housekeepers before Denise had left under circumstances nobody fully explained, and that it might be wise to keep a mental record of exactly where she was and when, just in case. Denise listened, unsettled but not entirely surprised, remembering the way Naomi's eyes had lingered on her a beat too long during her first week, sizing her up in a way that had nothing to do with job performance. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, in front of 3 other staff members gathered near the kitchen for the daily briefing. Marcus's voice was cold, controlled, each word deliberate in a way that stung more than shouting ever could. He didn't accuse her outright, not yet, but he made it clear that items had been disappearing since her arrival, and that he expected an explanation. Denise felt the heat rise in her face, humiliation washing over her in front of colleagues she'd only just begun to trust, but she didn't raise her voice, didn't protest with the desperation of someone hiding guilt. "I have never taken anything in my life," she said quietly, and turned back to her work, hands trembling only once she was alone in the pantry, pressing her palms flat against the counter until the shaking finally stopped. That same week, the walls seemed to close in on Denise from every direction at once, the kind of convergence that feels almost cruel in its timing. She received a call from Tyler's school on a Wednesday afternoon, the vice principal's voice clipped and formal, informing her that her son had been suspended for 3 days after a fight in the cafeteria. When she picked him up, his knuckles were split again, his eyes refusing to meet hers, until finally, in the car, the truth came out in a flood he could no longer hold back. Boys had been mocking him for weeks about the second-hand shoes he wore, about the free lunch line he stood in every day, about a father who wasn't around to buy him anything better. He'd finally snapped, swinging before he could stop himself, and now sat beside his mother carrying a shame he didn't know how to put down. Denise held his hand the rest of the ride home, saying little, because there was little that could undo what he'd absorbed about his own worth in that cafeteria. That same evening, her car refused to start in the driveway, the engine coughing once and falling silent for good, the mechanic's estimate arriving the next morning at a number that might as well have been written in a foreign currency for how impossible it felt. She said nothing about any of it at work. Not the suspension, not the car, not the 2-hour walk she now faced before catching the first bus each morning in the dark. Pride kept her upright in ways exhaustion alone could not, and she told herself, the way she always did, that this too would pass, the way everything eventually had. Inside the mansion, a different kind of unraveling was taking shape. Marcus opened the locked drawer in his bedroom one morning to find the velvet box holding Vivian's diamond bracelet, and for the briefest moment, felt something close to relief that it was exactly where it should be. That relief lasted less than a day. By evening, the drawer sat open again, the box inside it empty, and this time, Naomi didn't wait to be asked before offering her theory. She reminded him, voice heavy with practiced regret, that Denise had been the only staff member with unsupervised access to that hallway that morning, and suggested, not for the first time, that perhaps his instincts about people had grown too generous since Vivian's passing. Marcus called his head of security that night, his voice flat, drained of the warmth Denise had briefly glimpsed weeks earlier in the study. "Review every camera in that wing," he said, going back to this morning. "Find out exactly what happened in that hallway." Isabel found him afterward, pale with worry, and pleaded with him not to act rashly, insisting there was more to Denise than the story being fed to him one careful sentence at a time. Marcus, grief-hardened and cornered by his own inability to trust anything fully anymore, told her plainly that he'd heard enough theories for one lifetime and needed facts instead. He had no idea that the very cameras he was counting on for answers had already been quietly tampered with, 11 minutes at a time, by someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how far his trust could bend before it broke completely. The summons came on a Friday afternoon, delivered not by Marcus himself, but through Naomi, who found Denise in the linen closet and informed her, without a trace of discomfort, that Mr. Calloway wished to see her in his study before she left for the day. Denise felt her stomach drop, though she couldn't have said exactly why, some instinct warning her that whatever waited behind that door would not be a simple conversation about scheduling or duties. She smoothed her uniform, took a breath that did little to steady her, and knocked on a door she had once been forbidden from disturbing a chair inside. Marcus sat behind his desk, a folder closed in front of him, his expression unreadable in a way that felt worse than open hostility. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told her plainly that given everything that had gone missing since her arrival, and given what the cameras appeared to show, he was prepared to offer her a choice. She could resign quietly, effective immediately, and accept a severance check generous enough to soften the blow. Or she could refuse, in which case he would have no option but to involve the authorities and let them determine what had actually happened in his home. He slid a folded piece of paper across the desk, a resignation letter already typed, waiting only for her signature. Denise stared at that paper longer than she needed to, her mind racing through every bill sitting unopened on her kitchen table, every hour Tyler had spent afraid of what came next for them. That check could fix so much, could buy breathing room she hadn't tasted in over a year. And yet, signing it meant agreeing, in ink, to a lie about who she was. Her hands remained still on her lap. "I won't sign this," she said, her voice quieter than she expected but steadier than she felt. "I have never stolen anything from you, and I won't put my name on a paper saying otherwise, no matter what it costs me." Marcus's jaw tightened, surprised by a resistance he hadn't anticipated from someone he assumed desperation would make compliant. That same evening, in an entirely different room of the house, Marcus's son Julian found himself in an argument he'd been avoiding for months. Frustrated after discovering, again, that his monthly allowance didn't match what should have been deposited, he finally confronted his father directly, voice rising with a resentment that had clearly been building far longer than one missing paycheck. He admitted, almost reluctantly, that money had been disappearing from his account for over a year, and that he'd always assumed it was his own carelessness, some subscription he'd forgotten about, some purchase he couldn't quite remember making. Marcus barely registered the comment at the time, his mind still tangled in Denise's refusal to sign, unaware that his son had just handed him a thread that, if pulled hard enough, would eventually unravel everything Naomi had spent years carefully stitching together. Denise walked out of the mansion that night into a rain that hadn't been forecast, the kind that arrives suddenly and soaks through fabric before you've even registered you're wet. She had no umbrella, no ride waiting, nothing but the 2-hour walk ahead of her and a resignation letter she'd left and signed on Marcus's desk. She didn't cry until she was 3 blocks away, far enough that no one from that house could see her, and even then, the tears felt less like grief and more like release, the pressure of weeks finally finding somewhere to go. She thought about turning back, about how easy it would be to accept the check and disappear quietly into whatever came next. But every time the thought surfaced, she pictured Tyler's face and understood that some lessons about dignity mattered more than any amount of money could compensate for. She arrived home closer to midnight than she wanted, soaked through, shivering, to find Tyler waiting up despite her insistence he go to bed hours earlier. He took one look at her and didn't ask what happened, simply wrapped a towel around her shoulders and put the kettle on, a small act of care that undid her composure more than the walk itself had. She told him everything that night, unable to carry the weight alone any longer, and watched something shift in her 15-year-old son's face. Not fear exactly, but a fierce, quiet pride that surprised her. "You did the right thing," he said, voice steadier than she expected from a boy who'd spent the last month getting suspended for fighting his own battles. "Sometimes doing right doesn't pay right away, but it's still right." Back at the mansion, unable to sleep, Marcus found himself pacing the same hallway where Denise had once straightened a chair she didn't understand the meaning of. Naomi had prepared a summary of the security footage for him days earlier, a clean, edited account confirming exactly what she needed him to believe. But something about Julian's offhand comment from earlier that evening kept surfacing in his mind, a small inconsistency he couldn't quite explain away. On impulse, at nearly 1 a.m, he made his way down to the security office himself, bypassing the summary entirely, and requested the full, unedited footage from every camera in the house, going back not days, but months. He sat alone in that dim room for hours, coffee going cold beside him, scrolling through footage that told a story entirely different from the one he'd been fed, one careful conversation at a time. And somewhere around 3 a.m, his hand froze completely still on the keyboard, his breath catching in his throat the same way Denise's had that morning in the foyer, because what he was watching on that screen was about to dismantle every assumption he'd built his entire household around for the past 2 years. The footage that finally broke through Naomi's carefully constructed story began, of all places, in the servant's entrance camera from 3 months earlier, the very first week Denise had started working in the house. Marcus watched, jaw tightening, as a timestamp he recognized immediately showed Naomi entering the mansion at nearly midnight, long after her scheduled hours ended, carrying a bag he'd never seen before. She moved through the East Wing with the practiced familiarity of someone who knew exactly which cameras had blind spots, pausing outside his study for nearly 4 minutes before continuing toward the west corridor where his most valuable possessions were kept. He kept scrolling, hour by hour, night by night, watching a pattern emerge that had clearly been repeating for far longer than he wanted to admit. The cufflinks disappeared the same week Naomi had visited that hallway twice after hours. The first edition novel vanished 2 days after she'd been seen lingering near the library with that same unfamiliar bag. And then, finally, he found it. The footage from the morning the bracelet disappeared, not 11 minutes of nothing, as he'd been told, but a full, unbroken recording showing Naomi entering his bedroom at 5:40 in the morning, nearly 20 minutes before Denise had even arrived on the property that day. Marcus watched, breath shallow, as Naomi opened the drawer with a key she should never have possessed, removed the velvet box, and slipped it into her bag with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact motion many times before. What came next struck him harder than the theft itself. Later that same morning, the footage showed Denise walking past that same hallway, pausing when something caught her eye behind a decorative cabinet near the staircase, a small item that had clearly fallen and rolled out of sight. She knelt down, picked it up, and Marcus felt his chest tighten as he recognized the velvet box in her hands, not being stolen, but being found, carried carefully toward his study to return it, the very moment security had barged in and frozen the scene into something it never actually was. He sat back in his chair, the full weight of 2 years crashing down at once. Naomi hadn't simply been stealing small items for personal gain. She had been staging an elaborate deception, funneling stolen goods through a pawn contact for months, and using Denise as a convenient scapegoat to protect herself from an internal audit Marcus had casually mentioned weeks earlier during a board meeting she'd overheard. Every accusation, every carefully timed comment about Denise's access to different wings of the house had been a calculated distraction from a betrayal 15 years in the making, hidden behind a woman he had trusted with more of his life than almost anyone else on earth. Marcus didn't sleep that night, though not from exhaustion this time, but from a clarity so sharp it felt almost physically painful. By 7 in the morning, he'd called his head of legal counsel and requested a full financial audit of every account Naomi had ever touched, going back years further than even the security footage covered. What surfaced over the following hours painted a picture darker than a few stolen trinkets. Naomi had been systematically siphoning funds from household accounts for nearly 2 years, small enough amounts each month to avoid immediate suspicion, but consistent enough to add up to a second life Marcus had never known existed. A modest home across town, registered under a name that traced back to a man she'd been secretly involved with, someone Marcus had never once heard mentioned in 15 years of supposed loyalty. The missing money from Julian's allowance account fit into the pattern immediately. Another small stream diverted quietly into the same hidden life she'd been building behind everyone's back. Marcus sat with his legal team late into the morning, watching numbers scroll across a screen that told a story of patience and calculation far beyond anything he'd imagined her capable of. She hadn't just stolen from him. She had studied his grief, understood precisely how his guardedness after Vivian's death would make him slower to question the one person who'd been by his side through the worst of it, and used that understanding as cover for years. By early afternoon, Naomi was called into the study, unaware that the summary she'd once prepared for Marcus had already been replaced by the truth. She walked in with her usual composure, the same measured calm she'd used to manipulate every conversation about Denise, and it took her only a few seconds to realize, from the expressions of the legal team seated around the room, that something had fundamentally changed. Marcus placed a single printed still image on the desk between them, the timestamp visible, her figure clearly caught removing the velvet box from his drawer. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked her, quietly, to explain. Naomi's composure cracked for the first time in 15 years, her voice rising with a bitterness that had clearly been simmering far longer than her betrayal itself. She spoke of being overlooked for promotions she deserved, of managing his entire life, while watching him build wealth she'd never share in, of years spent invisible in a house that treated her competence as an expectation rather than something worth rewarding. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finally finished, he told her, in a voice devoid of the anger she perhaps expected, that being underappreciated didn't excuse building a lie elaborate enough to destroy an innocent woman's life in order to protect it. He had her escorted from the property within the hour, the full weight of legal consequences already set into motion behind her. Marcus didn't return to his study after Naomi was escorted out. Instead, he sat alone in his car outside the mansion for nearly 20 minutes, keys in the ignition, engine off, trying to figure out exactly how a man builds an apology large enough to undo 2 weeks of humiliation he'd personally inflicted on someone who had done nothing wrong. He'd never once, in 15 years, driven to an employee's home. He didn't fully know where Denise lived until his assistant, the new one hastily assigned that morning, pulled her address from personnel files with visible confusion at the request. The neighborhood looked nothing like the one he'd woken up in that morning. Modest apartment buildings pressed close together, a corner store with a flickering sign, kids riding bikes along a cracked sidewalk despite the late hour. He found her building, climbed 2 flights of stairs because the elevator was out of service, and stood outside her door longer than he wanted to admit before finally knocking. When Denise opened it, dish towel still in hand, her expression shifted rapidly from confusion to something guarded, bracing herself for whatever new accusation he might have driven across town to deliver in person. Inside, past her shoulder, Marcus could see Tyler at the kitchen table, a math worksheet spread out in front of him. The small apartment warm despite its size, filled with the kind of quiet dignity that no amount of money could manufacture. Marcus asked if he could come in, and something in his voice, stripped of the coldness she'd grown used to, made her step aside without argument. He didn't sit down right away. He stood in her small living room and told her everything. The footage, Naomi, the audit, the 2 years of manipulation that had cost her weeks of humiliation she never deserved. He apologized without softening it, without excuses about grief or misplaced trust, simply owning the harm he'd caused a woman who had shown him nothing but honesty since the day she walked into his home. Denise listened in silence, arms crossed, feeling something complicated settle in her chest. Not quite forgiveness yet, but relief so overwhelming her knees nearly buckled with it. He told her he wanted her to come back, not to her old position, but somewhere entirely different. He'd been quietly planning a housing initiative in Vivian's name for over a year, something that had stalled without direction he trusted enough to hand it to. He believed, watching her integrity survive pressure that would have broken most people, that she was exactly the person capable of running it the way Vivian would have wanted. Denise didn't answer immediately, glancing toward Tyler, who had stopped pretending not to listen entirely, watching his mother with an expression that told her, without words, that whatever she decided, he trusted her completely. Denise took 3 days to give Marcus her answer, days she spent not agonizing over the decision itself, but making sure she understood exactly what she was walking back into. She met with him once more, this time on her own terms, in a coffee shop near her apartment rather than the mansion that had caused her so much pain. She laid out conditions he hadn't expected from someone he'd assumed desperation would make agreeable to anything. She wanted full authority over hiring for the initiative, a salary reflecting the responsibility rather than her previous position, and an understanding, spoken plainly across that small table, that trust once broken required more than an apology to rebuild completely. Marcus agreed to every condition without hesitation, recognizing in her firmness the same quality that had first caught his attention months earlier in a study he'd once forbidden her from touching. The following months brought changes neither of them could have fully predicted. Denise threw herself into the housing initiative with an intensity born from personal understanding of exactly what families in crisis needed most, not charity delivered from a distance, but practical support built by someone who had once counted bus fare down to the last coin. She hired staff who understood struggle firsthand, designed programs around real obstacles rather than assumptions made by people who'd never faced them, and within 4 months had secured housing for 11 families who otherwise would have remained trapped in cycles Marcus's money alone could never have solved without someone like her guiding it. Tyler's transformation happened more quietly, but no less profoundly. The suspension that once threatened to derail him became, in hindsight, the lowest point before an upward turn nobody saw coming. Watching his mother refuse to compromise her integrity even when it cost her everything taught him something no lecture ever could have. He stopped fighting at school, not out of fear of consequences, but because he'd finally found something worth being proud of that didn't require proving anything to anyone. His grades climbed steadily, his anger softened into a quiet determination Denise recognized as an echo of her late husband, and for the first time since his father's death, she watched her son laugh freely, without the weight he'd been carrying silently for over a year. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated either. He began eating dinner with Julian more regularly, small gestures at first, then genuine conversations that slowly repaired a relationship strained by years of grief neither of them had known how to express. He didn't fall into anything as simple or predictable as romance with Denise, both of them far too grounded in their own healing for anything that convenient. What grew between them instead was something steadier, a mutual respect built on having witnessed each other at their most vulnerable and choosing honesty anyway, even when it cost them something significant to offer it. 6 months after that morning in the marble foyer, Marcus stood in Vivian's old study, the one room in the house he'd kept frozen in time for 2 years, and for the first time, opened the curtains fully instead of leaving them drawn against memories he'd been afraid to disturb. He moved the reading chair himself this time, not back into its rigid, untouched position, but angled slightly toward the window in a way that let more afternoon light spill across the room, the way Denise had once, unknowingly, tried to arrange it months earlier. It wasn't about erasing Vivian's memory. It was about finally letting the room breathe again, the way she herself might have wanted, rather than preserving it like something too fragile to exist in daylight. Denise's housing initiative expanded faster than either of them had projected, moving from 11 families to nearly 40 within its first year, word spreading through communities that had learned, often painfully, not to trust programs promising help they rarely delivered. She insisted on visiting every family personally before approving their placement, understanding better than any spreadsheet ever could exactly what dignity required alongside practical assistance. On the day the first completed housing project officially opened its doors, she stood on the porch of a modest but sturdy home, watching a single mother carry boxes inside with her 2 children trailing behind her, both kids racing to claim bedrooms they'd never had before. Marcus arrived just as the family settled inside, standing beside Denise on that porch in a silence that had long since stopped feeling uncomfortable between them. Neither reached for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. He simply watched the scene in front of him, A family stepping into stability neither of them could have manufactured through wealth alone. Only through the kind of understanding Denise carried in her bones from having lived through exactly this kind of struggle herself. "This is what she would have wanted," he said quietly, referring to Vivian for the first time without the heaviness that usually accompanied her name. Denise didn't need to ask who he meant. She simply nodded, watching the children's laughter drift out through an open window behind them. Tyler, now 16, had started volunteering with the initiative on weekends, helping move furniture, teaching younger kids in the program basic math the way his mother had once helped him at their own kitchen table. He'd found, in that work, something his mother recognized instantly, the same quiet pride that had carried her through her lowest moment, refusing to sign away her integrity even when every practical reason told her she should. As the sun began setting behind that small house, casting long shadows across a lawn that would soon be filled with a family finally allowed to feel safe, sometimes justice doesn't arrive with headlines or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a porch light left on for a family moving into their very first home. Proof that the truth, however long it takes, always finds its way to the people who refuse to compromise themselves while waiting for it.